So we will transition now. We're going to talk about 3 ideas from David Hume. So let's do it. A little historical background on Hume. He's an 18th century Scottish philosopher. So if you look at his death date there, you notice anything? So our country was born the year that Hume died in 1776. He was Scottish, and so his last name is pronounced something like Hume. I mean that wasn't too bad. That's kind of my Scottish impression there, Hume. But scholars say that originally his last name was spelled with an O. But it was still pronounced Hume, but it was spelled with an O. And I guess when Hume would go south, so Scotland is north of, like London in England, when he would go down to that area, all the people, they would be reading his name and they would call him David Home. And he got, this may be a myth, but he got so fed up with this that he changed the spelling of his name so that people in London would pronounce it right. He was a prodigy, kid genius. He graduated college when he was very young. Went to college when he was 12, maybe even 10. And he was writing books that are way more famous than even famous authors today. He was completing them in his mid-20s, 26. He wrote one of the books that we are referencing today. And if you're going to rank philosophers, at least the ones whose primary language was English, Hume might be number 1. So we've talked about Immanuel Kant, but his primary language was German, or Aristotle, Plato, their English didn't exist back then. So yeah, he's a super famous philosopher. Now, if you've ever, we're going to talk about three of his ideas, the very big ideas. One of them is about facts and values, about normative claims and descriptive claims, about saying how the world is and saying how the world ought to be. So all 3 of these are connected to each other. Remember when we were talking about one of the differences between, say, science and philosophy, one of the major tasks, maybe the task of science, is to describe the world, say how the world is, talk about the facts, natural facts. Now, when you leave that domain of the factual and you enter the domain of values, you're entering the normative domain. You're not just saying how it is, you're saying how it should or ought to be. And this is where training in philosophy would suit you quite well. And Hume, he's writing this very, very long book about ethics, and that almost as an afterthought, he taps into one of the biggest meta-ethical problems in the history of moral philosophy. And the problem is about this connection, or alleged connection, between facts and values, between the way it is and the way it should be, between the descriptive and the normative. And so this is called, there's lots of different names, the is-ought problem, the fact-value distinction, and so I'll just read some of this, kind of almost like he's writing in the margins. He says, "I can't forbear adding to these reasonings an observation, which may perhaps be of some importance." So he wrote this super long tome, this long book on ethics and moral philosophy, and then at one point he's like, "Here's just like a side thought I have. Maybe it'll carry weight, maybe it'll be interesting, maybe not." And of course, it's like one of the biggest ideas in the whole book. He says, "In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds from some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, establishes a being of God, or makes some observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. So he's writing in this old English, hundreds of years old. Essentially, if we're to paraphrase this, he's talking about, his scholarship. He's studying and reading about morality from people and philosophers who came before him, and when these people set up these systems of morality, how does it usually go? Well, sometimes they talk about God as the ultimate source of morality, or they will talk about human nature, and then eventually there'll be this big leap, this big jump. So they start with a description of the world. Here is how it is, and then all of a sudden they leap to, and here are the rules about right and wrong. Here's what you should do, what you ought to do. And so this is a logical issue. He's saying the reasoning, the logical move from the is to the ought, from the descriptive to the normative, seems to be an invalid move. There seems to be a gap there, like a waving of hands that is never fully explained. He says the change is imperceptible. However, it is of the last consequence. So you might not even notice. It's like a quick sleight of hand, but they skipped over something huge there. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained at the same time that a reason should be given. For what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. So that's a mouthful. What is he saying? What is he saying there? Well, he's noting the seeming difference in kind. The difference in kind between the domain of facts and the domain of values, from the descriptive to the normative, from the way the world is to the way the world should be. And an explanation is needed. And this is such a deep problem in philosophy that not even Hume really was able to solve it. And still to this day, philosophers will talk. There are books and seminars and endless debates about how to solve this problem. How to explain or how to fill in that gap between is and ought. This is related to the naturalistic fallacy, which goes something like this. Just because this is how it is, that doesn't mean that this is how it should be. For instance, human beings sometimes are deceitful. Does that mean that it's morally okay that we are? People are unfaithful in their romantic relationships sometimes. Does that mean that's morally okay? If you were to accidentally step on my foot or my toe, in that moment, that pain turns into rage, and I might want to kick and scream, maybe even, slap you or punch you or something, because I'm just so upset with you, ow, he stepped on my toe. But just because that might be a kind of a natural knee-jerk reaction, does that mean that it's morally acceptable? So just because this is how it is, or this is a natural reaction or a natural way of things, that doesn't automatically mean that it's morally acceptable. So that's naturalistic fallacy, and it's a subset because is to ought, because you're going from this is how the nature of things, this is how it is, to how it should be. What Hume is talking about is just in general, doesn't have to be a natural is. It could be something unnatural, like I got road rage and I'm about to ram someone with my car. That might be just the fact of the matter. That's not a natural thing. But even Hume would say, just because that is the case, doesn't follow that it should be the case. Now, can we think of a counterexample to Hume? Can we think of a case where going from is to ought is acceptable? Well, I'm just throwing out an extreme example, but how about something like this? Suppose someone is about to murder some innocent person. Call them Oscar. Oscar is about to kill the innocent girl, let's say, or guy, whatever. And this is just, you could just be like a reporter, just like you're just, like a on the scene reporter, just describing what's happening, just the facts, not trying to spin it either way, just trying to be totally neutral. This is, oh gosh, he's got the knife out. You can tell he's had this history of serial killer, and like he's going to be his next victim. It's just the fact of the matter. Does it not follow that this person should be stopped? They ought to be stopped. This would be a morally good thing. Most of us would tend to say yes, so that's an extreme example, but maybe that's a case where we can derive an ought from it is, and maybe Hume is overly worried, and maybe sometimes it's okay. Now, we could go into issues with that example. You might say, well, technically speaking, there's still a leap there. You've smuggled in a premise. There's some implied or tacit premise in there, something like, if someone's about to kill someone, then they ought to be stopped. And then when you pull back the curtain and you reveal that premise is hidden in there, then that serves as a bridge to the is ought, and the argument is no longer invalid, and even someone like a Hume would find that okay, but you've really just pushed the issue back one step, because you now have to explain that premise. So before, the is ought was the jump from the premise to the conclusion, from the Oscar is about to kill someone, conclusion, they ought to be stopped. But when you smuggle in that premise, now that premise is doing all the work. And so now the argument is fine, but when you zoom into the premise, the leap is within the premise. Instead of premise to conclusion, the leap is within that smuggled premise, perhaps. So that's going beyond the scope of this class, so I'll leave it there. And let's transition now to the last little bit we're going to be doing, which is talking about two more big ideas from David Hume on moral philosophy. So remember this chart here, and we've got moral realism, which is also known as moral objectivism here, and moral cognitivism. Again, these terms came later when philosophy expanded and got more analytical and got technical, and philosophers love to make up new schools of thought and new isms. But if Hume were to look at a chart like this today, or just neo-Humeans or disciples of Humeans, they would lean more to the right. They might endorse some form of non-cognitivism, and they certainly would reject both moral realism and cognitivism altogether. And so that we can find in Hume's writings, where he challenges or disagrees with the idea of moral objectivism or moral realism, and also rejects cognitivism altogether. So let's go through some of the language from his philosophy, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so this is a quote from David Hume. Take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact, that real existence, which you call vice. So translation, picture in your mind some heinous, immoral act. So the Oscar person is about to stabbing someone innocent. So, imagine that Imagine that happening. So innocent person being stabbed to death. And Hume invites us to almost try to locate the wrongness, what he calls vice. Where is the vice? He's asking. And he continues, in whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. You only find passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. So we might have this tendency to kind of circle this scene that we are imagining here. And we might say, oh, the wrongness is in that state of affairs, in that event. It's kind of out there. But Hume, his belief is, no, it's not so much out there in the incident. It's more in here, or perhaps in here. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. So when you're thinking about the incident, the event, the state of affairs, as like a journalist might, you won't find the wrongness, the vice. It will escape you. You can never find it until you turn your reflection inward into your heart, into your breast, and there you will find not a belief, but a feeling, a sentiment of disapprobation. So the part in red here, that speaks to realism or objectivism specifically. So when we say morality isn't so much an objective thing, that's what a moral realist would say. It's a subjective thing. That's what he seems to be saying here in the red. You're not going to find the whole story if you think about it objectively, like a realist would. Instead, you will find it when you go this way, when you go into your own heart and mind. That's a subjective claim, which would be the rejection of this. And then he's saying specifically, once you get into this subjective, I said heart and mind, but it's the part of our psychology, it's the mental state that is a feeling, a passion related to desire, a sentiment, he calls it. And so if we're talking about sentiments and feelings, then we're leaving cognitivism and we're going over here to maybe some form of expressivism. And he continues, this sentiment arises in you toward the action. So this is a sort of what we might call projectivism. We do this often, where what's going on in here, we impose it on the external world. We project it onto the external world. So we might point and say that's wrong, but we're really talking about ourselves, and we're projecting that wrongness externally. And Hume is astute enough to recognize this. So the sentiment, it's in you, and we project it toward the action. And this is a psychological fact that we tend to project. That's the matter of fact. But it's the object of feeling, not of reason. So again, that's a rejection of cognitivism. Again, these terms came after him, but if we were to take the newer language and use it for older ideas, then we would get that rejection of cognitivism. It lies in yourself and not in the object. Subjective, not objective. When you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature you have a feeling or sentiment, okay, so there we go, rejection of cognitivism, of blame from the contemplation of it. And now he makes an analogy to sounds and colors. Vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colors, heat, and cold, which according to modern philosophy are not qualities and objects, but perception in the mind. So this is a very old analogy. You could see it's older than Hume. He's talking about how, he learned about it in his ethics class, so 17th century philosophers wrote about this difference. It's related to the objective, but again, those terms are newer. but objective and subjective. You know, if you think about color, for instance, there's the experience of color, and then there's the physics or the science of color. Same thing with sound. There's the experience of hearing something, and then there's the science of sound. What's the science or physics of sound? Well, you learn about this in your other classes. Sound waves. Sound waves travel through the air, and then our sense organs, our ears, is able to interpret those sound waves, and then we have this experience in our minds. How cool is that? You know, it only took like however many millions of years of evolution, you know, for an inanimate object eventually to be able to be like a being like us, which is just mind-blowing. And same thing with color. There are waves of different lengths, wavelengths. For color, you know, if it's this long, we'll have a red experience. If it's this long, it might be violet or yellow. And it's really cool. So there are waves that enter our eyes, and they're processed by the biological machinery there. You know, we've got the light reflects off our retina, which is the back part of the eye, and then there are these things called rods and cones, and if it's colors, then the cones, they play a larger role. And then there is this really cool neurochemistry. We've got this nerve that connects our eyes to our brain, this optical nerve, and then it goes to this part of our brain, and you know, it would light up on an MRI, and we have this color experience. So there's the experience of red, you know, or like experience of blue here, and then there is the physics behind it, the waves of different lengths. And when we talk about the waves and the physics, we're talking about something presumably objective. And when we're talking about the experience, we're talking about something that isn't objective, it's subjective. And for Hume, morality is more like that experience of color and sound than it is about the objective things that cause the experience. And so if morality is more like the experience of color and sound, then morality, too, is subjective. And if it's subjective, then we should reject moral realism. And then finally he ends with, these rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of reason. So again, the two ideas here, the ones in red, are saying morality is subjective, not objective. And then in yellow, it's not about reason or beliefs or truth, it's about feelings. It's about the way that the feelings that show up in us when we experience the world. So that's David Hume. And then I'll end on this little funny image. So of course you might recognize this person. This is Zach Galifianakis. And if we are like a journalist, and you know, I didn't want to show a picture of murder, so we've just got like hot dogs being cut with a knife and then ketchup for blood. There's not something external in the world objectively that's wrong. For someone like Hume, the wrongness is something subjective, you know, so it's internal to us, and this arrow is pointing to the heart because it's not so much the thinking, facts, reasoning mind, it's sentiment, it's passions, it's desires. And we project this feeling onto the world. That's sort of projectivism. Okay, we did a lot today. That was a lot of fun. And gosh darn it, thanks for hanging out with me. Appreciate it.